horrifying. It all started with a strange dream. Oliver was already asleep, but he could still hear the noises coming from the streets. Along with the faint sounds of cars passing by and subtle humming of the fan, the nightlight in his apartment blended with the world in his dream as if it was coexisting with reality. He could recognize the noises, but he was seeing a different scene. Oliver didn't think much about it at first, but this seemingly harmless yet odd occurrence had turned into a series of terrifyingly realistic nightmares that grew worse on the following nights. After a very long day from work, Oliver was drop-dead tired and collapsed on the bed. He was still wearing his work clothes and shoes, but he fell right to sleep immediately after he closed his eyes. Just like his previous dream, the same thing happened again. He could hear the surrounding noises despite of his unconscious state. But this time around, it wasn't just the sound. His vision was also juggling between his dream and reality. His eyes were half open, and he was already dreaming while also seeing a small section of his apartment. Under his eyelids was a view of a dark place, and the other half was the sight of his dirty clothes lying on the floor. Triggered by his usual routine, he remembered that his phone was still in his pocket. Due to the partial view of his apartment, Oliver had a lapse in his memory and thought that he was still awake. But when he tried to reach for his phone inside his pocket, he couldn't move his arms. It was just then when he remembered that he had already fallen asleep. Out of physical exhaustion, Oliver was in autopilot mode and wasn't perceiving things clearly. He was more aware of what was actually in front of him rather than the dream in his unconscious state. It wasn't the first time that Oliver had a sleep paralysis, but he couldn't help not to panic for a bit. It took a lot of tries and struggle before he was able to move his hand, but he was pulled back to sleep again immediately after. The pull was so strong that it seemed natural for anyone to give in. He rolled to his side to pull out his phone from his pocket, but he dozed off before he could even reach for it. In Oliver's dream, he was in a dark room that was fairly similar to his apartment. This resemblance was the reason why he got confused and thought that he was still awake. When he was finally completely immersed with his dream, he realized that the place was completely trashed. The walls were torn and the floor was filled with gunk and molds. The sofa and the bed were also in the same spot, but everything else was but a clutter of mess. He was lying in the same position as when he lost unconsciousness, and the space in his line of sight was exactly the same spot where he saw his dirty clothes earlier. Oliver got up from the bed in his dream and looked around. This incredibly filthy place was quite unsettling to say the least. It looked like a scene from a nightmare, but nothing eventful was happening for it to be considered as such. Oliver looked outside his window and saw nothing but a complete void. When he tried to walk out the door, he just returned to the same room as if he was trapped in a loop. There was nothing else in the dream space but him and the room, and it seemed as if he walked inside an unfinished picture on a black canvas. Oliver never had this kind of dream before, and it felt disturbingly real despite of being so surreal. He usually wouldn't recall the things that he dreamt about, but he was bound to remember this particular one since he returned to the same dreadful place again and again. On the following night, Oliver tried to lessen the possibility of having another sleep paralysis. He was relatively at ease with no worries in mind. He positioned himself on the bed where he could easily sit up if he ever had to force his way out of his dream. However, he kept on twisting and turning for hours as he struggled to go to sleep. Before he knew it, Oliver ended up lying on his side again with the same view of the floor. To a certain extent, a person could tell if he was about to have sleep paralysis. Instead of being in a relaxed state, his body would begin to lose strength while being sucked into a level of sleep that is noticeably deeper than usual. It wasn't like how a person's hearing would slowly shut out while his sight gradually fades out. The sound volume of the noises from the background would subside, but they will remain present inside the dream. That was exactly what Oliver had felt when his consciousness began to wane. He tried to stop it from happening, but he failed. Oliver could hear a dog barking outside of his apartment, and there was also an audible voice of a person talking while passing by. However, the view right before his eyes was of the filthy floor and the tattered walls. The way his reality melded with his subconscious world was both confusing and disturbing. But there was another strange occurrence that happened between his dreams and his reality. He initially thought that only the things in reality could make its way inside the dream world, but what happened next was the other way around. There was a big black stain on the floor that wasn't present in his previous dream. As Oliver was forcing his eyes to fully open, he noticed that the stain in his dream suddenly became visible in his actual room. Half of what he was seeing was the actual floor of his apartment, but the black stain remained in its spot for some reason. Once again, Oliver was utterly confused. He couldn't tell if he was still dreaming or not. All he could do was stare at the stain while persistently trying to move. Luckily, he managed to do so after a while. He regained the control of his body and swiftly sprung up from the bed while wheezing. He checked the spot on the floor where the stain was, but it was no longer there. Oliver kept on having the same dream for days. In each passing night, the black stain on the floor gradually grew larger and larger. Oliver experienced sleep paralysis for consecutive nights that he eventually stopped resisting and just simply got used to it. Whenever his eyes would open while he was sleeping, he would just close it shut again and go back to his dream. Aside from the dreadful atmosphere and filth of the room in his dream world, there was no reason to feel alarmed. However, his perception changed when a lump began to grow at the center of the black stain on the floor. As time passed, it protruded even more. When he finally realized what it was, Oliver was horrified. The series of repetitive scenes in Oliver's dream was slowly turning out to be a long-dragged nightmare that haunted him for the rest of the following nights. What he thought was nothing but a lump of black sludge was actually a crown of someone's head. Little by little, it revealed more of itself. It was a head of a man with coarse black skin. He was a materialized figure of a shadow, and the black stain on the floor was his entryway to Oliver's dream. He waited until it was big enough for him to peek inside the room. His eyes were round and completely white. Only a half of his face was sticking out from the floor, but he consistently glared at Oliver until he was awake. Oliver feared that he would eventually crawl out to the surface, and he dreaded every single night. He tried to skip sleeping for a couple of days, but whenever he passed out, the head was there to stare at him without a single blink. Oliver talked to a lot of people in different fields in hopes that someone could help him, but none of them really believed him. He attended some counseling sessions for the possibility that his problem might be psychological. He also saw a few doctors who didn't know where to stand since they found nothing wrong in him. He also met up with a few quack doctors, but they had nothing useful to share. All his efforts were in vain. In the end, he was left to solve his problem on his own. He slept in different places in hopes that a change of location and scenery might stop the chain of his recurring nightmare, but not a single one of these things made any difference at all. Oliver did not sleep for 5 days straight in order to avoid seeing the shadow man in his dream. He was mentally drained and physically exhausted. Unfortunately, he was bound to fall asleep at some point. Oliver stayed on a bench at the park since the area was quite lively and it was helping him to stay awake. While he was surrounded by the noise of children playing, dogs barking, and cars passing by, he dropped his cup of black coffee on the ground. His body finally gave out, and he blacked out. Oliver returned to the filthy room in his nightmare, and the white-eyed shadow was still sticking his head out from the floor. However, the black stain had grown significantly larger since the last time he saw it. He gathered all the strength he had left in order to wake up, and he was quite surprised when he suddenly found himself back in his apartment. He was lying on his side, and his field of vision was zoomed in at the stain on the floor right in front of him. He desperately tried to get up from his bed, but he couldn't even nudge a single finger. Just as he feared, the white-eyed shadow began to move. His long and skinny arms reached out and stretched across the floor, and the rest of him was finally revealed as he lifted himself up to the surface. Oliver was profoundly petrified, and he couldn't even scream. All he could do was watch as this terrifying fiend was slowly crawling his way towards him. On the following day, the park officers were alerted when someone spotted Oliver lying on the bench. His pulse was dangerously weak. His eyes were wide open, but he was completely unresponsive. They brought him to the hospital right away. Sadly, Oliver Nielsen never woke up again.